Actions have emotional and legal consequences in ways most people do not fully understand until they are forced to confront the aftermath of their choices. In family dynamics especially, people often convince themselves that certain actions taken in moments of anger or stress are justified, excusable, or too small to leave lasting impact. Yet, it is usually these small moments, quick bursts of emotion, impulsive reactions, unfiltered anger, that end up shaping relationships for years. The human mind tends to focus on intentions, but life responds to actions. Regardless of what someone meant to do, what actually happened becomes the foundation of memory, interpretation, accountability, and in many cases, legal responsibility. At an emotional level, a single act, especially a physical one, can instantly rewrite someone's perception of another person. Trust, which often takes years to build, can collapse within seconds. When one person in a family momentarily loses control and crosses a physical boundary, whether with a shove, a slap, or a forceful grab, the message received by the other party is not simply "you were angry." It becomes, on a deeper psychological level, "my safety cannot be guaranteed around you." In relationships, safety is not just physical, it is emotional, relational, and psychological. Once someone feels unsafe, the emotional landscape changes entirely. What used to be love or familiarity becomes caution. What used to be openness becomes guardedness. And what used to be shared closeness becomes distance, fueled by fear or resentment. People often underestimate the emotional weight attached to physical actions. A child growing up in a family where anger leads to physical expression learns to associate love with volatility. An adult enduring aggression from an older relative learns that respect has conditions. A spouse witnessing physical confrontation between in-laws internalizes the message that conflict has no boundaries. Each person affected by a single impulsive act carries forward a different emotional interpretation. The person who acted out physically may regret it deeply later, but regret does not erase impact, nor does it undo the emotional wound imprinted on those who experienced or witnessed it. Humans interpret the world through personal meaning, and once a moment breaks their sense of trust, the emotional consequence becomes long-lasting, beyond interpersonal emotions. Family events involving physical aggression create a ripple effect that expands far beyond the individuals directly involved. Siblings take sides, spouses defend their partners, parents justify their behavior or deny responsibility, and extended family members absorb distorted versions of what happened. Suddenly, people who were not even present become emotionally involved. A single act of physical conflict rarely stays contained. It becomes a story, a memory, a reference point in every future disagreement. The family dynamic shifts from unity to division, from connection to tension, from mutual respect to quiet resentment. Even when people try to move forward, the memory reappears in their interactions, especially during new conflicts. This emotional ripple can last months, years, or even decades. Emotional consequences, however, are only one layer. Legal consequences often remain invisible until someone crosses a boundary that the law does not overlook. Many people believe that physical aggression inside a family is simply a personal matter or a private dispute, but the legal system does not view it that way. The law prioritizes safety regardless of relationship. A shove is still battery, a forceful grab is still assault. An attempt to restrain or intimidate someone physically can be interpreted as coercion or harassment. Even injuries caused unintentionally during a heated moment can result in legal liability. It does not matter if the aggressor didn't mean to harm. In legal frameworks, intent does not erase responsibility. The action itself and the harm caused define the consequences. Families often assume that because they are related, involving the legal system is unlikely. They think they would never press charges, their family. But when someone feels threatened, hurt, or disrespected, and especially when emotions collide with fear, people make decisions they never thought they would. A spouse may insist on legal action for protection. a partner may push for consequences to defend dignity, a child may feel obligated to protect their household, and once law enforcement steps in, families lose control over the narrative. A single act of physical aggression can escalate into restraining orders, mandatory reporting, legal documentation, and court involvement. In many jurisdictions, if physical aggression occurs in a domestic setting and someone reports it, or even if a third party witnesses it, the state can pursue a case even without the victim's cooperation. This means the aggressor could face legal consequences regardless of whether the family forgives them. What seemed like a momentary lapse of judgment can become part of a legal record, affecting employment, reputation, custody considerations, or future legal proceedings. Many people only realize the seriousness of their actions once they are confronted with paperwork, accusations, or the sudden involvement of authorities who do not share family sentimentality. Beyond formal legal consequences, there is another layer, the legal responsibility toward oneself and others. When a person reacts physically in anger, the risk of unintended harm skyrockets. Someone can fall, break a bone, hit their head, lose balance, or experience long-term injury from a push that was meant to prove a point rather than cause damage. When injury occurs, the aggressor is legally responsible regardless of intention. Even self-defense claims are heavily scrutinized when the situation involves family members, particularly when the reaction appears disproportionate or preventable. There is also the emotional legal intersection that most people overlook, the guilt, shame, and self-reproach that come after causing harm, even unintentionally. While legal documents can outline consequences in formal terms, the internal emotional consequences can be equally heavy. A person who acted out physically may find themselves haunted by the memory of the moment, unsure of how to rebuild trust, apologizing repeatedly without knowing whether forgiveness is possible, or feeling isolated as other family members avoid choosing sides. They may be forced to confront a version of themselves they never wanted to become. For some, this becomes a turning point, a moment of awakening that forces them to acknowledge unhealthy patterns in their behavior. Another important aspect is the breakdown of communication that follows a physical confrontation. Once physical boundaries are crossed, conversations become cautious, defensive, or entirely avoided. People no longer feel free to express concerns, emotions, or frustrations honestly because they fear that openness may lead to another escalation. The very foundation of healthy family dynamics, communication, becomes compromised. Silence replaces discussion, resentment replaces understanding, and assumptions replace clarity. Without open dialogue, misunderstandings multiply, making future conflicts more likely. Thus, one physical reaction does not only impact the past, it shapes the future. Emotionally, the relationship between the aggressor and the person harmed changes at a fundamental level. The harmed party may struggle between compassion and self-protection. Family roles become confused. Someone who was once seen as a source of guidance or authority now becomes a source of conflict or fear. Children witnessing such moments internalize the message that moments of anger justify physical expression, even if the adults claim otherwise. The long-term emotional consequences extend across generations if not addressed. All these consequences, emotional, relational, and legal, teach one powerful lesson. Emotional regulation is not optional in family relationships, it is essential. Families thrive on boundaries, understanding, and respect. When someone reacts physically, those pillars collapse. Recognizing the impact of one's actions is the first step toward healing, but preventing such actions is even more important. Conflict will always arise in families, but the response to conflict determines whether the result is growth or destruction. Furthermore, understanding the potential consequences helps individuals take accountability without falling into self-destruction. Accountability means acknowledging harm, not denying it. It means seeking ways to repair relationships while respecting the boundaries of others. It means being willing to change patterns rather than justify them. Emotionally, it means accepting that people may need time, space, or distance to feel safe again. Legally, it means recognizing that actions have formal consequences, regardless of personal explanations. Actions carry weight. They shape memories, influence legal outcomes, and alter emotional landscapes. They determine whether a family grows closer or falls apart. While no one can undo what has already happened, everyone can learn to respond differently moving forward. Understanding the emotional and legal consequences of one's actions is not about fear, it is about wisdom. It is about recognizing that in moments of anger, the cost of a single impulsive act may far exceed anything the mind can anticipate. When people understand this deeply, they gain the ability to pause during conflict, to breathe before reacting, to communicate before confronting, and to choose emotional maturity over emotional impulse. Families who embrace this knowledge become stronger, safer, and more connected. Families that ignore it often repeat cycles of conflict, hurting one another unintentionally and living with regrets they never imagined. BR. In the end, actions define outcomes. Emotional wounds heal slowly. Legal consequences remain documented. But awareness, reflection, and responsibility can change the future. When people learn to recognize the gravity of their actions, especially in moments of anger, they protect not only those they love, but also themselves. Unresolved. Family tension breeds escalation in ways that often go unnoticed until the breaking point arrives. Most people assume major family conflicts erupt suddenly, but in reality, they rarely appear out of nowhere. They are the final outcome of a long chain of small emotional fractures, moments of miscommunication, suppressed resentment, unresolved disagreements, generational misunderstandings, and unspoken expectations. These emotional fragments accumulate silently, layer upon layer, until one seemingly minor incident becomes the spark that ignites everything. Understanding how these dynamics quietly form is essential to preventing destructive outcomes. Families typically operate on routines, roles, and relational assumptions. Over years, people learn how others behave, how they argue, how they communicate, and what triggers emotional responses. When these patterns become rigid or unresolved, they create tension. One family member might always feel dismissed, another might feel misunderstood, another overburdened, another unappreciated. Yet instead of expressing these emotions directly, many people bury them to keep the peace. This silence becomes a silent pressure cooker in the relationship. Each unspoken frustration increases the intensity within the system, slowly compressing emotional resilience and reducing patience. Often, small conflicts arise, perhaps about household habits, lifestyle choices, parenting differences, financial boundaries, or traditions, and rather than being discussed openly, they are brushed aside. It's not worth fighting over. I'll let it go for now. I don't want to start a bigger issue. These thoughts may seem harmless, but avoidance does not dissolve tension, it multiplies it. Every unresolved moment leaves a trace. The mind remembers the hurt, the disrespect, the feeling of being unheard. Even if the other person forgets the incident, the emotional impact remains alive in the memory of the one who felt wronged. As time passes, these accumulated emotional residues form an invisible wall between family members. They continue interacting, but the connection begins to carry a brittle undertone. Words are taken harshly. Innocent comments feel like criticism. Neutral actions get interpreted through a lens of past unresolved conflict. Once the emotional charge accumulates inside a relationship, even a minor misunderstanding can reawaken the entire archive of past hurt. That is why people sometimes overreact to seemingly small incidents, not because of the incident itself, but because it hits the same emotional nerve that was never healed. Generational differences also play a significant role in unresolved family tension. Older generations often communicate differently than younger ones, value different things, and hold distinct beliefs about relationships, respect, and boundaries. When these differences are ignored rather than explored, tension builds. For example, an older family member might expect obedience where a younger one expects mutual respect. A parent might interpret independence as disrespect while the child sees it as necessary for adulthood. When these perspectives collide without discussion, misunderstandings accumulate, creating quiet resentment on both sides. In many families, unresolved tension becomes a cycle passed down. Parents who were raised in environments where emotional expression was discouraged often mirror the same behavior with their children. They avoid vulnerability, avoid conflict resolution, and avoid acknowledging hurt. Children, in turn, learn to suppress their own feelings, thinking that silence equals strength or survival. Over time, these patterns create emotional distance, making genuine connection difficult and leaving tension unresolved. When new stressors enter the family, like marriage, financial pressure, illness, or role changes, these unaddressed emotional gaps widen rapidly. Another contributing factor to escalation is the assumption that family members should just understand. People expect each other to know their intentions, forgive their missteps, or interpret their silence correctly. But assumptions without communication breed disappointment. When one person assumes good intentions and the other assumes hostility, every action is misinterpreted. The result is tension that grows quietly but powerfully. Miscommunication is a major force behind family escalation. Often, it is not what is said but what is not said that causes the most harm. Someone may feel excluded, slighted, or undervalued, and rather than expressing it, they withdraw emotionally. Another person may feel controlled or criticized and respond with passive aggression rather than honesty. These unexpressed emotions create a chain reaction where everyone begins reacting not to each other, but to their own assumptions and unresolved feelings. Over time, this distortion becomes the new normal. One of the most dangerous aspects of unresolved tension is how it reshapes perception. As tension accumulates, people begin observing interactions through a negative filter. A simple request can sound like a demand. A suggestion can feel like an insult. A complaint can feel like an attack. Once trust weakens, every interaction becomes charged with emotional history. Each side becomes more defensive, less patient, and less willing to compromise. This emotional rigidity increases the likelihood of explosive confrontation. Family roles can also intensify unresolved tension. Some individuals are placed in the role of mediator, others as troublemakers, others as peacekeepers, others as caregivers. When these roles become burdensome or unfair, resentment grows silently. The person labeled as the strong one may feel unsupported. The one labeled as the sensitive one may feel dismissed. The one expected to sacrifice may feel taken for granted. When roles remain unchallenged and unresolved, they trap people into patterns that eventually trigger frustration and conflict. Unresolved tension also breeds escalation when external stressors enter the family system. Financial strain, job pressure, illness, caregiving responsibilities, or major life transitions can amplify existing emotional cracks. Stress reduces emotional capacity, making people less tolerant, more reactive, and more sensitive to perceived disrespect. What might have been a manageable disagreement becomes a full-blown confrontation because the emotional resources to manage conflict have already been drained by other pressures. Another element that deepens family tension is the influence of loyalty dynamics. In many families, people feel obligated to defend certain relatives, take sides in disputes, or remain silent to avoid betraying someone they care about. These loyalty binds create internal conflict that individuals do not know how to resolve. They may feel torn between honoring one relationship and protecting another. When they suppress their true feelings to maintain loyalty, tension grows internally until it leaks out during conflict. Loyalty pressure often leads to emotional explosions because the internal struggle becomes unbearable. When unresolved tension remains active for long periods, the emotional distance between family members grows so large that they begin attributing negative motives to each other. Instead of assuming misunderstanding, they assume intentional harm. Instead of seeking communication, they anticipate conflict. Instead of offering grace, they prepare for defense. Once negative attribution becomes the default, escalation becomes inevitable. Even small triggers can lead to major confrontations because the emotional foundation has already weakened. At the deepest level, unresolved family tension often stems from unmet emotional needs. Someone may need validation but receives criticism instead. Someone may crave acceptance but receives judgment. Someone may need autonomy but experiences control. Someone may need boundaries but receives intrusion. When emotional needs remain unspoken and unmet, resentment grows. This unmet need becomes a wound that gets touched repeatedly, creating a predictable pattern, the same argument, the same trigger, the same reaction, again and again. What makes unresolved tension even more volatile is the illusion of temporary calm. Families often experience periods of apparent peace, moments where conflict seems to fade or disappear. But if the underlying issues remain unaddressed, this calm is temporary. It is not healing, it is simply the absence of a current trigger. Under the surface, the same frustration, insecurity, misunderstanding, and resentment continue to exist, waiting for the next spark. This false sense of peace makes the eventual escalation even more shocking and painful. Escalation often happens because one person finally reaches their breaking point. After years of staying silent, tolerating behavior, or absorbing emotional tension, they react suddenly and intensely. The reaction may seem out of proportion to the immediate situation, but it is not out of proportion to the years of accumulated frustration. This is why in many family conflicts, people say things like, "That's all it took for you to explode?" without realizing the explosion was not caused by the final trigger, but by everything leading up to it. Understanding buildup is essential for preventing destructive outcomes. Families must learn to communicate early, not when resentment has already taken root. They must learn to address tension directly rather than avoiding it. They must learn to express needs, set boundaries, and challenge assumptions before they harden into emotional distance. When families recognize the signs of unresolved tension, withdrawal, sarcasm, irritability, avoidance, passive aggression, silence, defensiveness, they can intervene before escalation occurs. True prevention comes through willingness to talk honestly, listen without judgment, reflect on one's own role, and embrace change. When unresolved tension is acknowledged and resolved, families can transform conflict into connection. But when it is ignored, minimized, or denied, escalation becomes unavoidable. Understanding this dynamic is the key to breaking cycles that might otherwise repeat across generations. Pride blocks accountability and healing in ways that are far more destructive than most people realize, especially in family conflicts where emotions run deep, identities are intertwined, and generational expectations shape behavior. In situations involving in-laws, pride tends to intensify because the relationship is already delicate, held together by marriage, cultural expectations, or family loyalty rather than lifelong bonding. When conflict arises, instead of pausing to understand the situation, many people instinctively default to self-protection. This self-protection is often misunderstood as confidence or strength, but it is actually pride masking fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of losing influence, fear of appearing weak, and fear of having to change. In moments of tension, pride convinces individuals that the problem lies entirely outside themselves. It whispers that admitting fault will dismantle their authority, that apologizing will diminish their worth, and that being vulnerable will give others power over them. In this mindset, self-reflection becomes nearly impossible. Instead of analyzing what part they played in the conflict, they focus entirely on the actions of others. A single disagreement becomes framed as an attack, a boundary-setting conversation becomes interpreted as disrespect, and even reasonable criticism feels like betrayal. This emotional lens distorts reality, preventing clarity and blocking the path toward reconciliation. The root of pride in family dynamics often lies in generational conditioning. Many people grew up being told that authority must never be questioned, that elders must always be respected without question, and that family unity demands silence rather than honest communication. When someone from a younger generation, especially an in-law, expresses discomfort or asserts a boundary, the older family member may perceive it as a challenge to their position within the family. Instead of hearing the message, they hear a threat. This emotional distortion leads to escalating defensiveness because pride refuses to allow the possibility that someone younger, newer, or outside the original family unit might have a legitimate point. In a conflict, pride transforms the conversation into a battle of dignity. People begin to prioritize winning the argument instead of resolving it. They seek validation rather than understanding. They fight to prove they are right rather than striving to create peace. Every word spoken by the other person becomes ammunition. Every silence becomes an insult, and every attempt at explanation is interpreted as manipulation. As pride builds, the possibility of healing shrinks. What could have been a manageable misunderstanding becomes a deep emotional wound, not because of the initial issue, but because no one is willing to lay down their armor long enough to truly listen. Accountability becomes nearly impossible when pride is in control. When individuals refuse to accept responsibility for their actions, they deprive themselves of growth. They cling to justifications, excuses, and exaggerated interpretations. They rewrite events to protect their self-image. They minimize their behavior while magnifying the mistakes of others. This lack of accountability not only damages relationships but also harms the individual internally. It creates a rigid emotional identity that cannot adapt, learn, or evolve. The inability to admit wrongdoing becomes a barrier that prevents emotional maturity. In the context of in-law dynamics, pride often shows up as territorial behavior. One family member may believe they know what is best, how things should be done, and what role everyone should play. When the new family member does not conform to these expectations, pride frames the difference as disrespect instead of diversity. The tension grows quietly until a conflict arises. In the heat of the moment, pride pushes individuals to defend outdated traditions, double standards, or unrealistic expectations simply because they feel entitled to them. Authentic connection cannot survive in an environment where one person believes their viewpoint is the only valid one. When pride overrides clarity, decisions made in the heat of the moment become catastrophic. People rush to take action not to resolve the issue, but to protect their ego. Instead of seeking dialogue, they seek allies. Instead of listening, they prepare counter-arguments. Instead of repairing relationships, they create emotional distance. This impulsive need to protect pride explains why some individuals resort to involving lawyers, threatening legal action, or escalating the conflict into a formal battle that could have been resolved with honest conversation. The involvement of lawyers in a family conflict is rarely about justice. More often, it is about control. When someone feels their authority has been challenged or their pride wounded, legal action becomes a weapon of emotional retaliation. It offers a sense of power, a way to make the other party feel the weight of consequences, and a method of asserting dominance. However, instead of restoring dignity, it fractures the family structure even further. Legal involvement introduces fear, mistrust, and long-term consequences that cannot easily be undone. The relationship shifts from emotional conflict to institutional conflict, making healing nearly impossible. The heavy cost of pride becomes evident when the emotional dust settles. After the anger fades, the defensiveness quiets, and the adrenaline recedes. Individuals often realize that the issue was never worth the damage caused. But by then, apologies feel insufficient, and the emotional distance created by stubbornness becomes difficult to repair. The person who refused accountability begins to feel isolated, misunderstood, or unappreciated, unaware that their own pride created the separation. Meanwhile, the injured parties begin to protect themselves with boundaries, distancing themselves to avoid repeating the same painful cycle. The family structure fractures silently, not from hatred, but from exhaustion. What makes pride particularly dangerous is its ability to disguise itself as righteousness. People tell themselves, "I have a right to feel this way." They should have respected me, I did nothing wrong. Or they pushed me to this point. These justifications become emotional shields, protecting the individual from the discomfort of self-reflection. But without self-reflection, no relationship can heal. No conflict can be resolved. No emotional growth can occur. As long as someone remains convinced they have nothing to learn, they will repeat the same destructive patterns. Healing requires humility. It requires the courage to say, I may have contributed to this problem. It requires the willingness to understand the other person's perspective, even when it feels uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging that impact is more important than intention. Pride resists all of these things. It convinces individuals that apologizing makes them weak, that compromising means losing, and that understanding the other person's viewpoint threatens their dignity. In truth, the opposite is accurate. Accountability strengthens relationships. Apologizing builds trust. Understanding creates connection. Humility does not diminish a person. It elevates them. The most profound damage caused by pride is the destruction of emotional safety. In healthy families, people feel free to express concerns, share vulnerabilities, and engage in honest dialogue. When pride dominates, people begin to walk on eggshells. They suppress their true feelings to avoid triggering defensiveness. They avoid difficult conversations because they fear backlash. They begin to distance themselves emotionally to protect their peace. Over time, the family dynamic becomes strained, artificial, and fragile. Pride also prevents genuine forgiveness. Instead of forgiving from the heart, individuals offer shallow gestures meant to restore appearances rather than relationships. They may say, let's move on, without addressing the root issue. They may pretend everything is fine while secretly harboring resentment. They may expect the other person to get over it without offering accountability. This superficial forgiveness creates a cycle where conflicts are never truly resolved. They are simply buried until the next eruption. To break this cycle, individuals must recognize that pride is not strength, it is a barrier to healing. True strength lies in emotional honesty. True resilience lies in empathy. True authority lies in self-awareness. Families that learn to replace pride with openness transform their dynamics dramatically. They become capable of resolving conflict without escalation. They learn to differentiate between intention and impact. They understand that disagreement is not disrespect. They value communication over ego. Healing begins when pride is set aside long enough for clarity to emerge. Once clarity is present, individuals can see where they went wrong, offer sincere apologies, and rebuild trust with patience. They stop viewing conflict as a threat and begin seeing it as an opportunity for growth. They become willing to create new patterns rather than repeating old ones. In families, this shift can change everything. In the end, pride may offer temporary emotional protection, but it always leads to long-term damage. Accountability, even when uncomfortable, leads to growth. Healing, even when slow, leads to peace. And humility, even when difficult, leads to connection. When families choose humility over pride, they choose unity over division, understanding over assumptions, and genuine healing over superficial peace. This is the path that transforms conflicts into resolutions and families into safe spaces once again. Healthy boundaries are often misunderstood as barriers that push people away, when in reality, they are the very structures that protect relationships from collapsing under the weight of expectation, emotion, and proximity. In every family, no matter how close or loving, there exists a delicate balance between connection and individuality. When this balance is respected, relationships have room to breathe, to grow, and to heal. But when boundaries are violated, even in small ways, the emotional landscape becomes charged with tension, resentment, and confusion. And when those violations escalate into aggression or control, the emotional damage can last far longer than anyone anticipates. Healthy boundaries are not about restricting love, they are about preserving it. Families often believe that closeness is a sign of strength. Many assume that being involved in every detail of each other's lives is a mark of loyalty, care, or unity. Yet the truth is that over-involvement frequently leads to misunderstanding and emotional exhaustion. When someone constantly inserts themselves into situations that are not theirs to manage, even with good intentions, the individuals on the receiving end may feel suffocated or disrespected. Healthy boundaries act as gentle reminders that each person has autonomy over their choices, feelings, space, and relationships. When these natural lines are acknowledged, interactions become healthier, decisions become clearer, and conflicts become easier to navigate. But when boundaries are ignored, emotional friction becomes unavoidable, and minor disagreements can rapidly escalate into major confrontations. One of the biggest challenges in families is recognizing the difference between support and control. Many people blur the line without realizing it. Offering advice can quickly shift into forcing opinions. Expressing concern can morph into policing someone else's life. Stepping in to help can become a pattern of interference. At the root of these blurred lines is an unspoken assumption that one person knows better than the other. This mindset alone is a boundary violation because it undermines the other person's ability to make independent choices. Over time, it erodes respect and fosters resentment. Healthy boundaries counteract this by affirming that every individual has the right to their own experiences, even when others disagree with them. In family systems, boundaries also define physical and emotional safety. Physical boundaries protect bodily autonomy, the right to feel safe, unthreatened, and respected in one's own space. Emotional boundaries protect one's right to feel without being judged, manipulated, or coerced. When conflicts occur, people often cross these boundaries unconsciously, fueled by anger, pride, or fear. They raise their voices, invade personal space, or resort to physical reaction. But these actions, once taken, linger in the emotional memory far longer than the argument itself. Even if the conflict happened in the heat of the moment, the person on the receiving end may struggle to trust again, and without trust, even the closest bond begins to fracture. Boundary violations create emotional earthquakes that shake the foundation of the relationship, sometimes permanently. Healthy boundaries require self-awareness, but they also require courage. Many people struggle to set boundaries because they worry about being perceived as distant, disrespectful, or unkind. They fear rejection or backlash. Others do not recognize that they are allowed to say no, allowed to step back, allowed to protect their peace. In family dynamics, especially where authority or hierarchy is involved, boundaries can be particularly difficult to assert. A parent may feel entitled to intervene in their adult child's marriage. An in-law may believe they have the right to direct household decisions. Someone may feel justified expressing criticism or anger because family should tolerate it. But boundary setting is not about rebellion. It is about establishing healthy limits so the relationship can remain functional and respectful. Without boundaries, emotional overreach becomes normalized, and conflict becomes inevitable. The lack of boundaries often comes from cultural, generational, or learned patterns. Some families operate on unspoken rules, such as we are involved in everything, we don't keep secrets, or elders must be obeyed. While these beliefs may have roots in tradition or love, they can be harmful when taken to extremes. They strip individuals of autonomy and reduce emotional independence. Generational habits, like controlling behavior or possessiveness, become ingrained and passed down as if they are normal. Yet, the absence of boundaries in one generation often breeds deeper emotional turmoil in the next. Healthy relationships require evolution, and evolution requires recognizing when old patterns are no longer serving growth. Boundaries also determine the tone of disagreements. When boundaries are respected, conflict can be handled through conversation, negotiation, and emotion regulation. But when people feel their boundaries have been crossed, they react defensively. They may lash out, shut down, or retaliate. The conflict becomes less about the issue at hand and more about the underlying feeling of violation. This shift in emotional energy can transform small misunderstandings into explosive confrontations. Families often look at the final argument as the cause of the damage, but the true cause is usually the slow erosion of boundaries leading up to it. When people do not feel emotionally safe, conflict becomes a battlefield rather than a bridge to understanding. One of the most crucial roles of boundaries is that they create clarity. Without boundaries, expectations become blurred, obligations feel heavy, and relationships default to unhealthy patterns. Family members begin to assume rather than communicate, demand rather than request, or pressure rather than support. The clarity that boundaries offer helps each person understand their place, their role, and their responsibilities. It prevents misunderstandings by creating a shared understanding of where emotional and physical lines are drawn. This clarity also reduces guilt, because when boundaries are respected, people no longer feel trapped in roles or emotional burdens they never agreed to carry. Respecting boundaries is an act of maturity. It requires acknowledging that love does not equal ownership, involvement does not equal entitlement, and disagreement does not equal disrespect. When individuals honor the boundaries of others, they send a powerful message. I see you, I respect your autonomy, and I trust your judgment. This message builds emotional safety, which in turn builds relational strength. Without that foundational respect, relationships operate in a state of tension, where one person's needs overshadow another's, or where emotional imbalance becomes normal. Healthy boundaries restore equilibrium and create space for genuine connection, rather than connection rooted in obligation or pressure. In the context of intense conflicts, especially those involving physical aggression, boundary violations become even more harmful. Physical altercations represent the most extreme breach of boundaries. They leave scars that are emotional as much as physical, even if the act is impulsive, even if the person regrets it instantly. The emotional impact of being harmed or harming someone else violates something deeply fundamental. It damages the sense of security that relationships depend on. It alters how people see each other, how they trust, and how they communicate. And often in families, instead of addressing the boundary violation directly, people attempt to justify it, minimize it, or shift blame. But healing cannot occur without acknowledging the seriousness of the breach. Healthy boundaries protect not only individuals, but the entire family system. When one person invades another's emotional or physical space, the ripple effects touch everyone. Children absorb the tension, spouses feel the pressure, and extended family members take sides. Conflict becomes communal rather than contained. Healthy boundaries act as a buffer, preventing disagreements between individuals from poisoning the whole family dynamic. When boundaries are clearly defined and respected, relationships become more resilient, more predictable, and more capable of recovering from conflict. Boundaries also support emotional growth. When individuals are allowed to experience the consequences of their actions without interference, they learn accountability. When they are allowed to make decisions, they learn responsibility. When they are allowed to express feelings without being judged or invalidated, they learn emotional regulation. Without boundaries, these opportunities for growth are lost. People become dependent, reactive, or controlling because they have never been given the space to develop the internal tools necessary for healthy relationships. Boundaries give people room to evolve. Finally, healthy boundaries require constant maintenance. They are not one-time statements, but ongoing practices that must be reinforced with consistency and respect. They shift and adapt as relationships grow. They require communication, empathy, and self-reflection. Most importantly, they require the willingness to prioritize long-term peace over short-term emotional reaction. Setting boundaries may cause temporary discomfort, but violating boundaries causes long-term damage. Choosing to respect boundaries is choosing to preserve the relationship itself. In the end, healthy boundaries are the strongest form of love. They prevent harm, nurture understanding, and protect the emotional well-being of everyone involved. When families commit to honoring boundaries, physical, emotional, and relational, they create an environment where trust can thrive, conflicts can be resolved without destruction, and love can deepen in a sustainable, respectful, and authentic way.